Today, I'm going to, of course, be talking about the rise of the British Empire. I'll get into mostly talk about the Tudor dynasty, which, by the way, is one of the most famous dynasties really in Britain's history. You've probably heard of the TV show that I think the Tudors, I think they had a long time ago, that was well famous. And most people have heard of, Henry VIII and, of course, Queen Elizabeth I. Of course, you see in the picture right there on the bottom right. Anyway, of course, like I said, I'm going to move on to talk about the rise of the British Empire. Of course, I'll mostly talk about the Tudor dynasty, of course, today overall. Tawana is also joining us as well this morning. And in fact, I'll just email me, Joshua, about that, and I'll see what I can do about that. Maybe I didn't grade it for some reason, your vocab, but just email me about it. So anyway, we're going to talk, of course, about the rise of the British Empire today. And like the British Empire, it really starts under the Tudors and also the Stuart dynasty. Especially, I know early part of the Stuart dynasty, you start seeing colonization going on, but it's really those two dynasties, that early modern times when the British Empire will rise in power. England, of course, is pretty much the state that develops the British Empire later. Of course, they later refer to it as being called Great Britain or the United Kingdom or UK. Those are common names, of course, used today. I usually say Britain for short or UK for short overall. By the way, the United Kingdom is one thing that's interesting about it, how it's amazing that it became an empire, because the United Kingdom, about, like, traditionally most of the landmass of it today is mostly those areas: England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, which is a little over 93,000 square miles. So it's amazing how this small little state became such a major power in the world, especially 19th century being the peak year, the British Empire itself. And you saw in the video how they talked about how the British Empire at one point was one of the largest empires, of course, in the world. I'll kind of show you this map here, but the empire itself peaked, they think, in the 1920s. I think 1920 or 22, I think, is the year they think when it peaked in size. Over 13 million square miles, of course, you can see, or if you want the kilometers, 35 million square kilometers, which at one point was close to about 25% or one-fourth of the total land mass of the area that they controlled, which some of that was in the Pacific, all that, which is kind of a large area as well. But you can see their empire was everywhere. It was obviously in the Americas, Africa, Europe, Asia, Pacific. So obviously on multiple continents that this empire was there at one point. It's the largest empire, by the way, after the other two. The other two empires that were pretty big too was the Mongol Empire. Say that was the largest land type empire that existed at one point back in the 13th century. I think that was like almost 10 million square miles. And the Russian Empire, which is third, somewhere like around 8 to 9 million in size, square miles in size, in comparison with that. Of course, they used to say about the British Empire that it was the empire which the sun never sets. And, it's true about that, which I think I talked about with the Spanish Empire. That's true with this, as you can see, with that map that you're looking at. Here's kind of also another one here, kind of showing a graph of the size of the empire and the population that they may have controlled, which they think about the 1920s, they had like a population of their empire which amassed between 400 and 500 million people in size. You can see their largest territory was actually Canada. You can see there that map right there, but you can see they're in multiple continents: Africa, Asia, Europe, and also into the Pacific and all that, in Australia. So that's kind of interesting how big this empire, got at one point, the British Empire. It all started, they believe, really under, going back as far back as maybe like the Tudor dynasties, when they think things really take off with that. So that's the thing we're going to get to today and talk about, of course, is the rise of the so-called Tudor dynasty that comes in. And Tudor dynasty reigned over, of course, England between 1485 to 1603. If you know about this particular dynasty, it came to power during a very turbulent time in British history. There's a period in Britain's history you may have heard about. I think I've got a picture of it right here, which was called the War of the Roses, which happened kind of at the end of the medieval times in England. It's probably like the last medieval war we had in England, and it was a really a dynastic struggle between these two royal families. One called the Lancasters, and the other family called the Yorks. And they were famous for having like different color roses in their coat of arms. Lancaster, I believe, had a red rose, and the Yorks had a white rose. Both these were English royal families that were part of the Plantagenet dynasty, which went back to medieval times. Considered one of the most famous medieval dynasty, in I guess in Europe at the time. Maybe the Capetians in France is pretty famous too, with the Valois dynasty they had there in France. And here's kind of a picture showing the different Tudor family tree right here. There was, of course, a famous king that would kind of rise to power, which was Henry VII, or Henry Tudor, as they call him usually. And he famously defeated one of the last Plantagenet kings, a man named Richard III, which a lot of people didn't really like in England. And he defeated him at the Battle of Bosworth Field, August 22nd, 1485. And within so much time after that, he would seize power as the King of England. And he became Henry VII, as he was called. And he would go on to marry Elizabeth of York, from the York family, because Henry was basically from the Lancaster side, basically. So that helped to kind of smooth over differences between the two royal families. And from there, he was able to reign in power for about 24 years, Henry VII. And Henry helped to kind of stabilize the country, especially economically, and get them on a footing, like a more normal footing, I guess, during that time. You can see a lot of the Tudors, of course, in that, of course, family tree that you're looking at. I'll kind of give you a list of all the different Tudors, but besides Henry VII, you've got his son, Henry VIII, of course, who would reign 1509 to 1547. Then Henry VIII had a son named Edward VI, 1547 to 1553. Then, of course, Henry VIII had another daughter, Mary the First, 1553, 1558. And then, of course, Henry VIII also had one more daughter. Youngest daughter, of course, Elizabeth the First, 1558 to 1603. Of course, we'll get to it later, but as you know, Henry VIII is very famous for his so-called 6 wives of Henry VIII, of course, which we'll talk a bunch of about those today overall. That's the next thing we need to really get into and talk about, of course, is Henry VIII, who really is, I think, considered one of the most famous kings of really the British history. If you really read about it. Of course, I think Elizabeth might be more famous. First one, greatest, more famous than Henry is, of course. But Henry VIII, by the way, was the second son of Henry VII, Henry Tudor. He did have a brother named Arthur, who should have been king, but he died before basically Henry, before really he could take the throne. And so Henry VIII got the throne instead. He came in 1509, would rule till 1547. And Henry VIII is famous for starting the so-called English Reformation in the country, where he founded the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, which really starts in the 1530s. And so England will break away from the Catholic Church. It was part of the whole Protestant Reformation originally happened. And if you remember correctly, what we had talked about before with Henry VIII was that what caused him to break away from the Catholic Church and form his own separate church in general is that he wanted to annul his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon was a famous Spanish princess, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. And they had a bunch of children, but none of the male heirs had survived. In fact, they only had one surviving daughter they had. And so part of why he formed this church was mostly dynastic reasons, and the fact that he wanted a male heir to put on the throne of England And his only surviving daughter, by the way, was Queen Mary the First later. Everybody calls Bloody Mary. That'll be the one that'll be later, the ruler after his son Edward the Sixth would die. So yeah, you've got all these famous, wives of Henry VIII that come in, of course, later we'll be talking about. Of course, Catherine of Aragon is in this picture right here. Sometimes spelled with a K instead of a C. Of course, you have all the other six wives of Henry VIII: Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, which are well known. There's often a famous rhyme, they always talk about with the six wives of Henry VIII, which you may have heard a little, rhyme thing that goes: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. So we'll kind of go through all those, of course, later. But yeah, he wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon and, of course, remarry so he could have, of course, a male son and all that. And so that's basically the reason why that he will eventually do that. Hey, Elijah, what's going on this morning? Anyway, what happens is he did this through basically acts of parliament at that point, which were passed through Parliament with Henry VIII. And there was one that was very important that he passed in 1534, which was known as the Act of Supremacy. What that basically did was it made Henry VIII the head of this new church, the Anglican Church or Church of England. And he also made him the head of state. Now it's Supreme Governor is the common title that they use now, which was later, I think, adopted under Queen Elizabeth I later. He also confiscated all the lands of the Catholic Church. He closed all the monasteries, all the convents were closed down, all the churches, I guess money or whatever, he basically seized everything, which made it more powerful, of course, in England. He also made all the clergy take an oath to his new church at that point. And there were some clergymen that wouldn't do it. They wouldn't take an oath to this new church, that just wanted to stay with the Catholic Church. The most famous was Sir Thomas More, if you know about that. He was eventually executed for not basically conforming to this new church that he would basically create, in England. They often call it Anglicanism, of course, the common term later, which spreads all over, the world because of the British Empire. You got different Anglican churches all over the place. I think they call it Episcopalian church, I know, in the United States, but it later becomes a Protestant church, but initially under Henry VIII, it was not. It was still kind of this Catholic church that was with him in power, in control of it instead of the Pope. So people sometimes call it the Henrican Catholicism, I think is the common term they use for it. They did start adopting things like English Bibles, like there's the so-called Great Bible of Henry VIII that they developed under his reign. Which was one of the first complete Bibles to be developed. There was one before that named the Tyndale Bible, developed by this guy named William Tyndale, I think in the 1530s, but it was never finished because he was executed by the Catholic Church and all that. Then you have the King James Bible, which will come out under King James of England, of Great Britain, of course, in I think 1611 later. So that'll be the different English Bibles. We'll even have, all the sermons will be in English, and all that later as well. So going back to, of course, the so-called six wives of Henry VIII, he would eventually get this, divorce that he wanted. And so he married Anne Boleyn, who, by the way, happened to be the sister of one of his mistresses named Mary Boleyn. And I think he had wanted Anne Boleyn to be a mistress of his too as well. But he eventually married her in 1533, and that marriage lasted about 3 years, and giving him one daughter later, of course, which was later Queen Elizabeth I. And that marriage did not work out well because he wanted a male heir and all that. And so later she accused her of treason, of I think a bunch of things. I think she accused her of adultery with her brother, witchcraft, and a few other things to kind of get rid of her. So he kind of fell out of disfavor with him, and so he had her executed, beheaded in 1536. And so he was out of his second wife at that point. So I went to Jane Seymour. Seymour was, I think, one of the lady in waitings to Anne Boleyn, and so he became like one of Henry's court favorites, and would really be, they think, Henry VIII's favorite wife that he would have. And she would produce one male heir for him, legitimate male heir, of course, which would later be King Henry VI, as they called him. But she died right afterwards from some kind of complications from childbirth. She died in 1537. So basically, within what is basically a matter of 4 years, he goes through three wives. So then he has three more, which he didn't really have any children through those other women, which were Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. But I'll go ahead and talk about them also as well. His fourth wife was Anne of Cleves, who he married in 1540. She was actually this German princess that he decided to marry for political reasons. And she came over to England, and apparently he did not like her. He never consummated the marriage with her or anything like that. And I think it was one of the shortest marriages. I think it only lasted a month or so, if it was even legal. And so he basically divorced her, was done with her. But I think he kind of remained friends with her afterwards, but he didn't really like her much. Then he married this teenager named Catherine Howard, who I think was 17 when he married Henry VIII. The only thing is, though, they found out later she was having maybe this affair with one of Henry VIII's friends. It was like at his court, named Thomas Culpeper. They found letters where they were writing to each other, apparently. Kind of debate about whether he was really having an affair or not, or he was just trying to have an affair, or was going to have an affair with her, maybe, or something like that. It was found out about that. And she was later executed in 1540. I think it's 1542 when she's actually executed. But he divorced her too, but had her beheaded. Then he had one more wife he had too, which was Catherine Parr, who was a divorcee that had been married two times before. So they're kind of perfect together. And so that last wife, of course, he stayed married to for around 4 years. But she actually survived. She actually died after he died. I think she died like the next year after he died or something like that. Didn't live that long. But basically, those last three wives, of course, he didn't really get any children out of it, things like that. And Henry suffered a lot of like illnesses at the end of his life. You read about that. And I think there's some speculation that he might have had syphilis as well from sleeping with all these different women in general. Because he had six wives and he had all these other mistresses that he had on top of that. It's kind of crazy. But anyway, let's talk about what happened after Henry died. Now, after Henry died, by the way, in 1547, died in January of 1547, he left the throne to his only, legitimate son that he had, which was Edward VI, who, by the way, becomes one of the first Protestant rulers, of course, that England has. You got a picture showing Edward, who's up there, who, by the way, came in when he was just a boy. He's kind of like the boy king of England, if you want to put it that way. He came to the throne when he was 9, and he died at the age of only 15. So he reigned like maybe about 16 years in power, 1547 to 1553. And why was he so sick? Well, he had tuberculosis, which I think in the old days they called it consumption. And so very tough reign. There is a famous novel written kind of about this period you may have heard about called The Prince and the Pauper by I think Mark Twain. You may have heard about it, and kind of covers this kind of period under Edward VI. But one thing that happened under Edward VI, which is very important, like I said, he became the first Protestant ruler. The reason why was because Calvinism, which started in France and in Europe, spread to England, and so that made that form of Protestantism very popular. So the Anglican Church starts to become more of a Protestant type church during that time period. And Edward has this famous prayer book that becomes real popular with the church, with the Anglican Church, which is called the Book of Common Prayer. And one of the men that, of course, helps to develop it is Thomas Cranmer, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury. If you know about the Anglican Church, it has mostly these two archbishops, which are really important underneath the, I guess, the head of the state, the monarch, which is the Archbishop of Canterbury and then the Archbishop of York. Supposedly the Canterbury one is the higher one of the two archbishops. But Cranmer was considered one of the first major archbishops of Canterbury under the Anglican Church. He's the one that helps to kind of helps to edit it and develop the Anglican prayer book, which was more of a Protestant type prayer book rather than being Catholic. And of course, you can see it was written in English instead of, say, Latin. So that's very important about that. And that'll be eventually over time the main prayer book that Britain's going to use, like with their church and all that. A lot of times it's often called BCP for short. You'll see it sometimes abbreviated like that as well. Now, the only thing, though, about Edward, like I said, Edward's very sickly, had tuberculosis. There was kind of a debate about who should get the throne. Should it go to his half-sister Mary, who was Catholic, which was kind of a big problem. But he had this cousin of his who was named Lady Jane Grey, and he wanted to give the throne to her. Jane Grey, by the way, was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII. So he thought maybe we could do that instead. I think Parliament kind of agreed to it at that point. And so she tried to seize power in July of 1553. The so-called 9 Days Queen, I think she's sometimes nicknamed today. But what happened was, you know about this, the half-sister, of course, of Edward said, hey, hell no, I'm going to be the ruler instead. You see here, of course, to the left right there. And so Mary Tudor, seized power. She had the right to the throne, because one of the daughters of Henry VIII. So she took power instead in 1553. She later had Lady Jane Grey in prison and eventually executed during her reign. And Mary was very unpopular. People did not like her at all. Of course, as you know, Mary is later nicknamed the so-called, Bloody Mary. They call her. I think now it's a drink or something like that, as you know. But of course, the British are famous for using that quote, bloody, bloody this, bloody that, as you know. And what happened in her reign was when she came in, she started this counter-reformation where it was almost like the Spanish Inquisition. They began persecuting English Protestants throughout the country. And she had a lot of people executed under her reign. In fact, she closed down the Anglican Church and reopened the Catholic Church in England. People often called it the so-called Marian persecutions, and even had about at least 280-something people executed. A bunch of them were even burned at the stake under her reign in the 1550s. In fact, the most famous that was put under this burned at the stake was Thomas Cranmer, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, was executed in 1556. So she was not very popular at all. Then they had this other problem that happened during her reign. They had a big rebellion break out, which is well known, and it's called Wyatt's Rebellion, which happened in 1554. And what caused it was the fact that right before this, she had married Philip, who was the Crown Prince of Spain, who just happened to be the son of Emperor Charles V. He was the King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor that ruled over a good chunk of Europe that we've talked about before. Philip was later known as Philip II, who would be a big rival to Queen Elizabeth I under her reign. He, remember, later tries to invade England, 1588. So the marriage sparks this huge rebellion, which I think was mostly dominant in the southeastern part of England, although I think other people rebelled, I think, in England as well. And it was led by this man named Thomas Wyatt. They sometimes call Thomas Wyatt the Younger, who lived in the region of Kent, which is kind of like in the southeastern part of England. Kind of to the south or southeast of London would be where it is. And several thousand rebels joined up with Thomas Wyatt, hoping to maybe seize power and put in somebody that they didn't think would create like a Spanish Inquisition, which I think is what they thought was going to happen. Anybody that was like, not Catholic was going to get persecuted throughout the country. And they thought, she should have married an Englishman. That was, not such a controversy with Spain and all that, which England and Spain were not really liking each other anymore. But what Wyatt, I think, at one point got to England. I think his forces, I think, at one point even reached close to where the London Bridge is, near the Thames River, in River Thames, but Wyatt was eventually captured and beheaded, 1554. They're not sure what Wyatt and his movement was going to do. There's kind of a debate, about whether they wanted to put Elizabeth on the throne, maybe, the half sister of Mary or something like that. Nobody really knows what their whole goal was of the movement, but obviously they didn't like, Mary, being in power right there. So you can see Philip, top left there. He's later becomes king right after this happens, and so they didn't like this, new guy coming in and trying to. They thought he was going to try to take over England, maybe, possibly as well if she died. So that leads into, of course, the last period, of course, under the Tudor dynasty, which you've got the rise of Queen Elizabeth that you have that comes into power, Elizabeth I, and Mary. What happened to Mary and all that? Well, Mary had this weird thing during her reign that was called the phantom pregnancy of Mary. And for a long time, like during her reign, she thought she was pregnant the whole time. In fact, there was some kind of impending thing that she was going to have a child, maybe even a son, and be Catholic, obviously, which would be bad because I guess it would be an Anglo-Spanish type, kid that might be able to inherit both the English and the Spanish thrones, that kind of deal. But they find out she has cancer instead, uterine cancer. I think kills her in the end of 1558. So she died without any heirs. But later, we'll get to it later, but what's going to happen is Philip will try to invade and try to seize power. Well, it looks like Michaela and Kayla are also in StreamYard that joined us earlier as well. Now, let's talk about Elizabeth's reign. You see, of course, I'll kind of blow up, of course, a picture of her right here. Elizabeth reigned as really the last Tudor monarch. She reigned from 1558 to 1603. She is, by the way, one of the longest reigning monarchs in British history, like the fourth longest overall. I think it's like close to 45 years. That's how long she was in power. They think Queen Victoria, I think, in the current ruler, I think, is Elizabeth II. Those are some of the longest. Of course, they have later. But they do consider Elizabeth I to be one of the greatest monarchs in British history. They think it's under her and later under King James that you see really the rise of the British Empire afterwards. That's probably one of the most famous paintings of her, I guess, on the left. There's been a lot of different paintings, of course, of Elizabeth that have been done over the years. And she had all kinds of names. As you know, her most common name, of course, was the Virgin Queen. Of course, because the fact that she never married. Some people think she even stayed a virgin throughout her lifetime. Usually a reigning female monarch is often, that's not married or doesn't have a consort. It's often called a virgin queen. Use that term. She was also called Good Queen Bess or Gloriana. Those are other nicknames that she was often called, but sometimes she could be Bad Queen Bess or Frightful Queen Bess as well. So she persecuted people under her reign. I think those were Catholic or something like that. Kind of were persecuted a little bit under reign. But her reign is very important. It's like the period of the so-called golden age of England, they call it, or the so-called Elizabethan era. It's also the beginning of the Shakespearean era, which kind of goes under her reign and under King James's reign, where William Shakespeare wrote a lot of his plays and sonnets that made him world famous overall. But during her reign, when she first came in, there was a lot of controversy about what to do with the religious status of England at that point. Should she go back to being Catholic nation or Protestant? And of course, as you know, she chose to go Protestant. And so what she did was she created this so-called bunch of reforms that were known as the Elizabethan Religious Settlement, which was done by Parliament through a bunch of various acts, of course, between 1558 and 1559, which restored or reformed the Anglican Church. And the church that we see later is pretty much, developed under her reign afterwards, because the Reformation kind of goes up, through this period. Anglicanism itself is a type of religion, which is kind of a quasi religion between, it's mostly Protestant, but it does have a lot of Catholic influences in it. They did this on purpose, trying to bridge the two religions, Catholics and Protestants, to kind of get them to join a common state church in general. And so they kept a lot of things like the clergy, like the priests and the bishops and things like that were things that they kept, in the church. Like the priests' robes, the icons that were used like in the Catholic Church were kind of borrowed also as well. English sermons, of course, were developed instead of Latin type, sermons, mass, etc. Book of Common Prayer, became, like I said, that becomes the main prayer book of the Anglican Church, pretty much worldwide after that. And then, of course, the big thing they did different from the Catholic Church was they allowed the priests to marry, which they thought was something they need to do within the country and all that. So it's something she's definitely famous for with all her reforms. Now, they did have this thing where you had to attend that church. If you know about, England during that time, it wasn't really like, religious freedom or anything like that. So they had this thing called the Act of Uniformity, which came out in 1559 under the Act of Parliament. And basically, it said that all had to attend this church, or you could be fined, or I think even possible, maybe imprisonment, short term, or something like that. Something you could do. And so they had that occurred. They also had the Act of Supremacy, which came out, I think, again in 1559. The Act of Supremacy was kind of a continuation of a similar act that was under Henry VIII, where it made basically the monarch again the head of the church and state, except instead of supreme head, the title became supreme governor. And that's the common title used today, of course, for the monarch of course, the UK today. That's used. They also have this thing called the 39 Articles that came out as well. I'll just mention about it, but the 39 Articles were a series of religious articles that became the main theology of the Anglican Church, which of course are still around today, more or less. There's a lot of famous buildings associated, of course, with the Anglican Church. Here's some right here. Of course, there's this famous Canterbury Cathedral. That's, of course, where the Archbishop of Canterbury, his headquarters of where he's at, basically under the church. So that's a very important building right there. Also, as you may have heard of Westminster Abbey, that goes back to the Middle Ages, which is in Westminster, London. That is a very famous church and monastery that it was originally a monastery, I think, the church, but it's basically a famous church that is where a lot of the royal families are married. Like, so when like a king gets married or whatever, a queen gets married, that's basically where it takes place. Westminster Abbey is also very famous for a lot of people being buried there, not just famous royalty, but a lot of famous poets and musicians and other big people in England have been buried there also as well. Now, I did want to talk about also today about this cousin of Queen Elizabeth named Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. She was very important because she was the closest rival and closest heir to Elizabeth. She was her first cousin. She was also the Queen of Scotland, which you can see here often called Mary, Queen of Scots, is what they usually call her. Who, by the way, had a very controversial rule over her kingdom, which she kind of ruled. You can see there for around 20 years that she was in power. She, by the way, was a distant relative of Henry VII, Henry Tudor. She was actually the great granddaughter of Henry VII, and so that entitled her to possibly get the throne if Elizabeth died. Elizabeth didn't have any children, as you know. She was controversial because she was married multiple times. You can see here, at one point, she had 3 husbands that she went through. Francis II, she married briefly, but he died young. I think she was actually older than him. I think they married when they were teenagers, and he died right after. I think they were married like 2 years, and he dropped dead. So at one point, she was the queen consort of France, but came back to Scotland. Then she married this other guy named Lord Darnley, who was known as Henry Stuart, and he was also related back, I think, through the Stuarts as well. He was kind of important, who I think could have gotten the throne too. I think he was a relative somehow, going back to the Tudors. But problem with him was he had more whiskey in his veins than Stuart blood, and so he was like a drunk. I think that was married to her, and they became estranged. And Mary had this lover that she had named David Rizzio, who was like one of her private secretaries, who also taught her music. And Lord Darnley became jealous of him and had him murdered, killed him basically. And then, of course, what happened was Mary became had this relationship. This other guy she had named the Earl of Bothwell was James Hepburn. I think he became kind of connected with him too as well, like a lover. And they say that the Earl of Bothwell got jealous and killed off Lord Darnley, killed him off, like her second husband, and she was somehow implicated in it. So they accused her of conspiring with the Earl of Bothwell to kill Lord Darnley, Henry Stuart. And so what ended up happening to her, she was actually forced to abdicate the throne of Scotland. This happened in 1560, I think 1568, I think, when she abdicated the throne. But she was imprisoned at one point, Mary Stuart. And one point throughout Scotland, people were putting handbills on walls or on trees, which depicted a mermaid. Back in those days, a mermaid was a symbol of a prostitute, basically. And so she had all these men, I guess, that she had, Mary Stuart. And Mary Stuart, by the way, was very good looking. A very good looking woman. So that's a pretty good looking painting there, I think, I guess, with her painting you can see there. But supposedly she would turn men into like puddles of water. That's how good looking she was. So yeah, her reign was very controversial. And so what happened was she decided to flee the country. There was some kind of jailer that was kind of, I guess, because he was so good looking, I guess, kind of felt sorry for her. And so he let her out, and she fled the country. And she fled to England, thinking that her cousin Elizabeth would help her get her throne back, put back on the throne. But she was like, I'm not putting a Catholic back on the throne. No way. And so basically what ended up happening was Elizabeth put Mary up in a bunch of castles in England and imprisoned her for about 20 years, is what ended up happening. So kind of a sad story about, what happened to Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. And she does basically have I'll get to it later about the importance of, I guess, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots. She does have this son. You kind of see this through this kind of family tree here, how they're related. But there's Mary Stuart, married to Henry yeah, Mary Queen of Scots married Henry Stuart. She does have a son through Henry Stuart, who James VI of Scotland, who by the way became king as an infant when Mary was forced to abdicate. After she dies, he'll end up getting the throne of England right here, and so that's basically important later about why Mary Stuart is such a big deal. Mary Queen of Scots, and all that. Oh, the other problem they had in Scotland as well. Scotland was starting to go through this thing called the Scottish Reformation, where they were heavily influenced by Calvinism, just like England is. And they had this man named John Knox who had met John Calvin in Switzerland. He came back from Switzerland, started the Church of Scotland, which became the Presbyterian Church. And so they didn't really want a Catholic ruler on the throne. And so what ends up happening, of course, is that Mary's son, James, ends up being later Protestant, basically. And so they didn't want a Catholic ruler and all that. What happened to Mary Stuart? Well, she got implicated in this thing called the Babington plot, which they think was actually a fake plot that the English were kind of involved in, because they were trying to implicate Mary Stuart to get rid of her in some kind of plot against Elizabeth to maybe try to kill her, which there may have been some kind of plot. There was a guy named Edward Babington, I think his name was, who they think was trying to set up some kind of assassination plot against Elizabeth to kill her and put Mary on the throne, because a lot of Catholics wanted Mary on the throne instead of a Protestant in England. However, in England, Elizabeth had a lot of these spy masters all over the place, like spies, and it was run by this guy named William Cecil, who was the chief advisor under Elizabeth. Later, her son Robert, and this guy named Francis Walsingham discovered the fact that Mary was somehow trying to smuggle letters out of some kind of beer barrel called the beer barrel letters or something like that. They suppose they caught her, and she was put on trial and later executed in 1587. So she basically executed her own cousin to, I guess, prevent her, maybe a Catholic, from trying to take over the throne at that point. But the death of Mary Stuart is going to end up, like I said, later putting James on the throne. James VI of Scotland later become James I of England. That's going to be important later, because that's going to lead to the founding of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Because England and Scotland will kind of become joined as one United Kingdom. Now, another thing about going back to talking about Elizabeth. Elizabeth, like I said, never married. There were two men that she came close to marry. One guy on the left, Sir Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, and also, believe it or not, the King of Spain, King Philip II of Spain, was the other one that she thought of a possible marriage as well, but that was kind of controversial. She really loved Robert Dudley. In fact, she even drew up letters to marry him and things like that. She even gave him a title, the Earl of Leicester. And he was a handsome man. He looked really good on a horse. Which a lot of men that look good, I guess, on a horse if you got really good legs, that kind of thing. But the only problem with Robert Dudley was that he was married. He had a wife. And there was a kind of a controversy over this, because his wife was kind of ill. And all of a sudden, she fell down a flight of stairs and died. And so, now there's a possibility of marriage between Elizabeth and Robert Dudley. But it was kind of too hot, because they're thinking, did he push her? That kind of thing. They didn't really know. And she never married anybody, of course, Elizabeth and all that. And that's one of the famous stories. And whether she remained a virgin, that's been debated, because, they've debated that Robert Dudley and her were lovers, but it's never been really officially proven overall. Now, of course, the big thing that happened, under Elizabeth is, of course, the famous Sea Dogs, of course, where we have all these conflicts that break out between England in Spain. They call it the so-called Anglo-Spanish War of the 1480s that go up to about the time of King James's reign. Basically, England and Spain were fighting for supremacy over the Atlantic Ocean, part of Western Europe, English Channel in general. And one thing that's very famous that Elizabeth did during this time was she sent these privateers named sea dogs, you may have heard of, to attack Spanish shipping throughout the Atlantic and also in the Pacific Ocean as well. And they're very, very famous. A lot of these men that would be kind of in the early part of the so-called Royal Navy or kind of associated with the Royal Navy of Britain later, which the Royal Navy was originally founded by King Henry VIII in 1546. And a lot of these men were privateers. They were hired by the English crown under Elizabeth. Most of them had letters of marque where they could attack enemies like Spain, take their ships, seize their gold or silver. And those are really the most famous sea dogs, as they were called in England at the time, which were mostly in the late 15th, early 16th, late 16th, early 17th centuries. And of course, Sir John Hawkins was very famous. He was considered one of the great naval commanders that was associated with the Royal Navy, especially with the defeat Spanish Armada in 1588. Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Humphrey Gilbert, those were actually half brothers of each other. They're kind of related to each other. And Sir Walter Raleigh was known for his explorations of the East Coast of North America. He's one who kind of came up with the name Virginia. You know about that, named after the Virgin Queen. Sir Humphrey Gilbert also explored the eastern coast of Canada, supposed to be exploring like Newfoundland, all that. Oh, Raleigh also explored South America in search of El Dorado, I think in like the Amazon region. And then Sir Francis Drake, they always talk about Drake the most. Drake was really considered to be one of the most famous of the sea dogs that they had. And he was also a well-known explorer of the English in the late 18th century overall. And he was well known for his circumnavigation of the world, which took place between 1577 to 1580. And this was actually a planned expedition of the English under Queen Elizabeth I. I think I do have a map showing you his circumnavigation, but the English were trying to kind of explore and find out more about the world in general. They also wanted to raid like Spanish ships that were in the Atlantic, but also in the Pacific Ocean, like on the other side of the Americas. And so what happened was in 1577, Drake set sail with 5 ships for this expedition, which took between 2 and 3 years to go around the world. It is one of the first successful circumnavigations of the world, which is true because if you remember correctly, Magellan died halfway around the world, but Drake was one of the first to successfully go around the world. He did have a very famous ship that survived the expedition, which is well known, which is called the Golden Hind. The Golden Hind was a type of English galleon ship you see there, which I think was originally called the Pelican, but he changed the name to the Golden Hind on the expedition. And that's not the original ship. The original ship was actually a museum ship, which they had in England for years, but it rotted. They had to tear it up. They've built like 2 or 3 replicas of it over the years. And so they think that's what it kind of looked like with the expedition overall. And when Drake returned to England in 1580, he was actually knighted. So he became Sir Francis Drake. He was dubbed. The Spanish, by the way, had a nickname that they called Drake. By the way, they called him the Dragon, or El Draque, I think was what the Spanish actually called him. They called him that because of the fact that he was famous for seizing some of their ships and burning them, basically after he took all their gold or whatever, or silver. So Drake was definitely one of the most famous um, English sea dogs. He was very famous for raids on Spain, like the raid of Cadiz in 1587, and then also his attack and defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. And that's the other thing I want to talk about today, which, of course, is very famous. That, of course, occurs at the end of really, Elizabeth's reign, is the so-called defeat of the Spanish Armada, which, of course, you can see here, which that actually took place between about 15 August 1588 is the time period, like the summer of 1588 is when it is. A lot of these men, like Drake, Sir John Hawkins, they were involved, of course, in helping to defeat the Spanish Armada in 1588. And what happened was in 1588, Philip II attempted to invade England. Why did he want to invade? Well, he wanted to basically seize control of England and start a counter-reformation, which Mary had, failed to do. Philip was a big proponent of the counter-reformation to try to reconvert Europe back to being Catholic. And so that's pretty much the reason for it. So he built this huge Habsburg, armada they formed, which was nicknamed, by the way, by him. It was called the Invincible Armada, which included about 130 ships were involved. I think 8,000 sailors were involved with the actual fleets that were involved. And it had like a military force that they were also they were going to try to ferry over and try to invade England in the summer of 1588. I do have maps showing kind of the route of the Spanish Armada as it left Spain in July of 1588. It was actually led, by the way, I'll kind of show the man who led the fleet, but it was led by this man named the Duke of Medina Sidonia. He was the commander of the fleet. And you can see Philip II on the right, of course, the actual monarch who was in power at the time. But the route, they were supposed to land like troops on the southern coast of England. And they were going to try to march on London at that point. But the Royal Navy was able to attack, even though they had a smaller force, smaller ships compared to the Spanish fleets, which were at massive galleons that they had at that point in the late 16th century. And the English even used like what they call fire ships, where they would set unmanned ships on fire and send them through the Spanish fleet, which helped to break them up. And the smaller Royal Navy would decisively defeat the Spanish Armada. They do think that weather played kind of a major role, like bad weather. I think even the English believed that the wind was blowing in the right direction. I think they always call it the weather vane was blowing in the right direction for their cannonballs. And Battle of Gravelines, which took place near Flanders, close to almost into the North Sea, was really, I think, the most decisive battle. But they think storms helped to kind of scatter the actual Spanish fleet up into the actual North Sea. And I think I've got a map showing the route that they would take. Where is it? Map right here again. But the Spanish would actually have to sail all the way around Scotland and Ireland to get back. And they end up losing like around half their fleet or more. It was actually lost in the actual invasion of the Spanish Armada. And I don't know if I have extra numbers on it, but I think 40, 50, I know ships were lost or scuttled. And there's a bunch of 10 to 15 were also captured also by the British. And I think some sailors also tried to land on the Scottish, Irish coast. I know Scottish coast, I know in the north, and they either captured or killed also as well. So the defeat of the Spanish Armada, that was a major event in British history. A lot of people think that's kind of like a turning point for England overall, because after this actually happens in 1588, you start seeing the English become more powerful worldwide. They even start trying to colonize. I know Elizabeth tried to colonize some in on the North American coast, like in Virginia, North Carolina. I think it was initially, and then also Newfoundland, but they failed in the beginning. But under King James, who'll come in later, her cousin, will be more successful with that, and England's going to start colonizing, of course, later. Now, it didn't really break the back of the Spanish, like their naval power and all that. They still have naval power after that, but Spain really struggles afterwards. They start declining really in the 17th century, which a lot of it had to do with economic reasons. And Spain actually, their government went bankrupt like several times, apparently after that. They do think that 1588 was the peak of Elizabeth's reign. They always talk about her famous speech that she gave at Tilbury. I think it's called the Speech to the Troops at Tilbury, which was given on August 19th, 1588. It kind of epitomized, how powerful she was. And she said the famous quote that, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king and of a king of England." So even though she was a woman, a lot of people kind of thought she was a king and all that because she was so powerful and her success was so well, of course, during her reign. Now, the only bad thing about her reign was who should get the throne. That was a big controversy about that because eventually she would die at the age of 69 at 40 after a 45-year reign, and I think pretty much everybody knew, who was going to get the throne. It was going to go to her second cousin, who was the King of Scotland, King James VI, who just happened to be the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, in general. And so he's going to come over and inherit that. That's going to be important because James is going to, of course, end up starting what is really now what we call the United Kingdom of Great Britain, because eventually he's going to merge England and Scotland together. Of course, Wales already, they think, part of it was also there too. But he'll basically start this new dynasty. The Stuarts will take power at that point. They think that's when basically the British Empire really takes off after that. Because under James, they start colonizing different parts of the world. They colonize, where the 13 colonies are. Virginia, that'll be colonized first, where Jamestown, first colony there. Bermuda, Northern Ireland is colonized. They even go into, of course, Canada, start colonizing there also as well. Of course, there's another thing about Elizabeth I did want to mention about her, about what happened to her and all that. Like, how did she die? That's been kind of a mystery, about her death in general. Overall, they're not sure. There's like several causes of death about her. They've talked about because no post-mortem or no type of autopsy was done on her, so nobody knows what exactly killed her. They think it was either from the lead poisoning from her makeup, because a lot of times her face would be chalky white in a lot of paintings. The makeup in those days, they put lead in it. And so she may have gotten cancer, or maybe it may have killed her from lead poisoning. It's been possible. Stroke has also been put forth as another cause of death. Obviously, she was pretty old. She was 69 years old when she died. So maybe natural causes in the end is all it is. But we'll talk later, of course, about the Stuart dynasty. I'm going to, of course, be moving on, to talk about the Stuarts later in the week I think on Wednesday coming up overall. So I'll kind of get into like the Stuart dynasty. And of course, one thing we're going to talk about that's very famous that occurs at the beginning of that period is going to be the English Civil War. And that's going to totally change the British history after that, because they're going to decide how much power the monarch's going to have. Parliament's in power, the king's got power. Who's going to have all the power? Who's it going to be? we'll see later the Glorious Revolution decides that. Of course, when Britain becomes more of a constitutional monarchy, which it is today. So I'll get to that later, of course, in the week with that. So I don't think there's any questions right now about, looks like nobody has any questions right now. But if you have any comments, questions, of course, later about this lecture, please let me know. If you got a question about the class, just email me about that. I think there's maybe one or two ask some like email questions about something like that. But just email me if you have an administrative type question about the actual class or assignments and things like that. If you want to make up, let me know about that via email also as well. You can also subscribe to my channel if you want to as well. So that's it for today. Like I said, later in the week, I'll kind of continue, talking about the Stuart dynasty, what happens under the early British Empire. So that's it for today. I hope you'll have a good, midterms this week. I guess it's week 7 or whatever it is we're in right now. So I'll see y'all later, of course, in the week. So y'all take care overall.